Welcome back to Inside Florida Politics. There's a lot to talk about. Mary Ellen, let's start with you. A broad question to begin our discussion today about really what did we learn from the 2012 election, Mary Ellen, about where Florida is going politically, how it's changing?
It was, to me, the most interesting election of my life. It's probably because Florida is now proven that we are a purple state. Not only because we got the batters, and we're battered and bruised from all the television attention we got from being such a swing state, but also because the electorate is definitely down the middle. We saw that with, even though we've got 400,000 more Democrats registered to vote in Florida, it was a tight election everywhere. Obama won with a healthy margin, but we have a Republican legislature. Very few seats changed over. So I think that the question for the leadership in Florida going forward is, how do they govern this very purple state, and how do they govern from the middle? And I think that's what's going to make it so fascinating to watch.
Brent, do you think the Florida House and Senate will try to govern from the middle? Did they get the message here?
Well, that's a good question, and they probably need to in view of what happened. Although there wasn't a great changeover for the first time in a long time. Democrats made some gains, both in the congressional representation from Florida. The first time in the Senate in 30 years they actually gained seats, and they made slight gains in the House. So I'm with Mary Ellen. I think Florida is a purple state. I think there were significant issues for the leadership to recognize. And I think one of those issues was the deck seemed stacked to some degree by legislatures across the country trying to position themselves more favorably and these are Republican-led legislatures. And I'm not so sure that it didn't backfire on them in the general election in view of what happened across the country.
Steve, how about you? How did you read the tea leaves of the 2012 election?
I think that Florida was a purple state this election. And that's not the same thing as being a purple state. And what I'm saying is that it's the magical and the tremendous ground game that the Obama forces put out there, which had an effect on the electorate and the turnout. The turnout was not, percentage-wise, a little bit lower than it was in 2008. But I look at the landscape in this state and I see a Republican Party that's dominant in both houses of the legislature. They're dominant in our congressional delegation. They control most of the statewide offices. And so they're not going to give that up lightly. And I think that what I do see, though, is I see that the Republican Party is being forced to move away from the... One thing you didn't hear at all this cycle was the Tea Party crowd. They just more or less disappeared. So the Republicans have to find a new voice, a slightly more moderate voice, but I'm not ready to declare, that Florida's moving to the Democratic column. Far from it. I think the Republicans are still strongly entrenched in the state.
So maybe we're in transition, huh? Is that possible?
I don't think we're in transition. Okay. I actually think we are where we are, and I don't think we're going to move. I think we are going to be a state that's got a tug and pull between the red in the dominance in the legislature and the blue in the dominance with the voter registration rolls. And in between, that's a purple. And I think that if we figure out in Florida how to work this, we can be a bellwether, as Florida always likes to be, on how to move forward.
We can be. We can be a bellwether if we can just count the votes in time. We'll be a bellwether.
Look at where the young Cuban vote is going, Steve. That's always been a reliable Republican constituency. It is no longer. Obama got practically half of that vote because the young Cubans are not voting where mom, dad, grandma, and grandpa did. So the state it's fascinating. Right. I mean, I have to agree, it's a fascinating.
That's the other demographic shift that was so interesting is in Orlando. It is the buckle of the belt that is the bellwether part of the state, the swing part of the state, and it went Democratic. Every constitutional office there were in that region went to a Democrat, and the surrounding area went Democratic in some races. I mean, we had
including Hispanic.
And we elected Hispanics for the first time to the state legislature from that area. We elected the second openly gay Democratic legislator from that area. that is also the region, even though it's not Orange County, but Seminole County, where Chris Dorworth was unseated. He
Big
was
story.
an incoming House Speaker, was outspent his opponent, his Democratic opponent, Mike Cleland, 7-1, and he lost. Went down to a recount, but those dynamics made for a fascinating election.
Speak well for the voters in a lot of ways, don't they, Mariel? I mean, they showed nationally and they showed in Florida, I think, that they can think for themselves and don't necessarily have to pay it. I mean, this is the first year that you could have money pouring into this thing that nobody had to be accountable for. You could kind of stack the deck, so to speak, and it didn't seem to pay off. I would guess Karl Rove would agree with that assessment.
Brent, let me ask you this. You're kind of talking in this vein anyway. Maybe one of the things you just said is one of the big surprises of this election is a lot of the voters think for themselves. But let me just throw this to you and say, for you, what are a couple of the biggest surprises of the 2012 election in Florida?
Well, I think maybe Obama winning, as Mary Ellen pointed, not a huge margin, but he carried the state. It was called early, as it was. I think most people saw Florida as possibly, more likely than not at least, Romney's state to win this go-around. He didn't. And I also think the gains, and I know Steve says Republicans are entrenched, they are, but all of us were in town also when the Democrats had this margin in the late 80s, and it can turn around rather quickly, and it did during the 90s for the Republicans. This is the first time in, 16 or 18 years where I think there's been any sense of optimism for the Democrats. And I've got to believe, with the governor's race coming up in 2 years, and with Governor Scott's approval ratings sitting where they are, that they've got to have some encouragement that, maybe we can win that race. So whether or not they can remains to be seen, but that's the next biggie here in Florida, I think, and I think you're going to look at a fascinating governor's race in a couple of years.
Steve, surprises?
Well, two things. I was surprised by the fact that the voter turnout in Miami-Dade and Broward counties was as healthy and strong as it was, because we've seen several elections in a row where they've underperformed. The lack of now not in the presidential so much, but for example, a stronger turnout in Dade and Broward, and Alex Sink would be the governor of the state today. There's no question about it. I covered politics in Broward County for a long time. They talk a good ball game, they seldom deliver. This time they turned out. Something else. It's very rare that an incumbent member of Congress gets knocked out of office. It does happen. It happened to Clay Shaw in Fort Lauderdale a few years ago, and this time it happened to a young man named David Rivera, who had problems up to his eyeballs, ethical problems and others, and was knocked out of office by the voters in Miami-Dade. So I find voters to be increasingly discerning about who they're putting into public office.
And
All right.
I think
I'm
the
sorry, go
candidate, I'm just going to go to Steve, as you mentioned turnout 2 years ago in the governor's race, the presidential race. I think obviously the candidates play into that, and Obama's been tremendous at getting turnout, whereas I think probably part of former CFO Sink's issue was that she had a hard time generating great support.
If there's an over-the-top turnout of Democrats in Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach, that is that's almost impossible for a Republican to overcome.
Giles, he won it on that Broward alone.
There are that many Democrats in that part of the state.
Years ago that made this a Democratic state, were those three counties down there turning out.
And I think you can argue that it's possible that Miami-Dade carried the state for Obama, and Miami-Dade obviously carried, Obama carried Miami-Dade. There were, in 2008, Obama had a margin of 104,000 votes. This time around, 240,000 votes was his margin. So I think that kind of was, as Steve has said, they showed up. And if there's any surprise for me, the surprise was the effect of this early voting. And Brent mentioned it. It was some people believe, and I think there have been some political observers and participants in the Republican Party who have acknowledged that there was an attempt to suppress the vote using these shorter early voting times. I think that possibly worked as a backfire. And in the end, when there were people standing in line waiting to vote, and showing up to vote, and you have the power of social media as people are, sending text messages and beaming messages to their friends, that the message came across, somebody doesn't want you to vote. And I think the result of that, may have brought more people to the polls in the end than maybe otherwise would have had.
Jack.
Sort of saying, if they don't want me to vote, I'm going to vote. I was in, on election day, I was in Central Florida in a very Puerto Rican precinct in the center of Orlando, or Central Florida. And it was fascinating. There was a steady stream of Hispanic voters, and there were people who were wheeling their elderly parents in wheelchairs so they could show up to vote. These are people who could barely speak English, but they were Puerto Rican, they could vote, and they were not going to not show up. And that was, to me, the surprising
And
thing.
the Florida ballot got loaded up by the legislature, you know, I mean, which, again, I suppose a skeptic might say that, well, there's a reason for that as well, because they could, you know, that's what led to the long lines in part too. You got to go through all these darn constitutional amendments, and all but 3 got beat. So, you know, there's, if you're suspicious about such
No,
things.
you're not
you know,
suspicious or
right, yeah.
cynical. You've only been covering
But you
government
get-
for a few
yeah,
years.
Yes, I like to leave cynical out, Steve, but you get highly skeptical of that, particularly when it was a pattern across the country in states where there are Republican legislatures and
So
Republican
what I'm
governors.
getting out of this, just to summarize before we go to break, is that to some extent, some of the traditional means of influencing voters, big time television, a lot of, let's say, political maneuvering and so forth, voters pushed back and said, not necessarily, we're not going along with that. Does everybody kind of nod to that might have happened this year? Let's go to break and we'll come back and talk about the governor's race for 2014.